Advisory Council, so it's really wonderful to welcome him back. As an accomplished diplomat and author, I think he very much personifies the Wilsonian idea of bridging the world of ideas and world of public affairs, the idea that the Wilson Center seeks to promote and as our means of memorializing President Wilson. On the academic side, he's held several academic appointments at Dartmouth, Vanderbilt, Columbia, Mount Holyoke, Hamilton, and Princeton. He was, I believe, the first George F. Kennan professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies, carrying on a tradition which George Kennan carried on of not only being active in diplomatic service, but also being a writer. On the diplomatic side, he served in the American Foreign Service for 35 years. This involved far too many posts to mention, but he was, I can just briefly say, he was Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for European and Soviet Affairs at the NSC under Presidents Reagan and Bush Sr. He was Ambassador to Czechoslovakia and, of course, the Soviet Union, where he served many times throughout his career. He had additional postings in Vienna, Munich, Zanzibar, Dar es Salaam. He was Director of Soviet Affairs at the State Department and Deputy Director at the Foreign Service Institute. And we're here because he is, in addition to all of this, a very prolific author. He's written a number of books, including Reagan and Gorbachev, Autopsy of an Empire, and Superpower Illusions, which you saw when you came in, and hopefully he will convince you to buy on your way out. And we made sure he has a pen so he can autograph copies for you if you wish. Finally, he's a native of Greensboro, North Carolina, and he was educated at Duke and at Columbia. Jack, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Blair, and thanks for the invitation to come and see so many old friends. Thank you for coming out, and particularly those of you who had to bear with me when I was in the service and who know very well I tend to talk too long. But I wrote the book, which is now called Superpower Illusions, because I was really disturbed by the way the events leading to the end of the Cold War and the end of the Cold War became distorted in many people's minds, and I think contributed to a whole series of foreign policy errors that were made after the Cold War ended. You know, I guess my favorite American philosopher is the famous Yogi Berra, who has said that he doesn't remember saying half the things that are attributed to him. But one of the things I like best, whether he said it or not, was it's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know that ain't so. And that's the reason when I was writing this most recent book, my working title was Distorting History. Well, my editors at the Yale University Press thought that people don't like to buy books about history, particularly distorted history. And after long negotiation, we settled on the current title, which I'm also comfortable with, Superpower Illusions. But what are those myths and mistaken ideas that I think have led us to a situation where we are, as a nation, much weaker in the world and even weaker at home than we were when the Cold War ended in the late 80s or the very early 90s. I name a number of them in the book, and I'll just mention some of the most basic here. First of all, the idea that the Cold War ended when the Soviet Union collapsed. It ended well before the Soviet Union collapsed, at least a couple of years before. And I can testify, as one who, having been engaged officially in U.S.-Soviet relations from 1956 on, that the relationship in 88, and particularly from the beginning of 89, changed from one of confrontation to one of problem solving. And though not all the problems that had arisen during the Cold War were at an end, in 1988, the ideological war which lay behind it was put to rest by Gorbachev in his speech at the UN December 7th, 1988. From 89 and 90 and 91, when we had very important negotiations, Soviet and American diplomats worked in tandem to work those out in the interests of both countries. So the idea that somehow the Cold War didn't end until the Soviet Union collapsed is a very basic misunderstanding, but it's one that has persisted. And when I was shown the last section of this multi-part documentary on the Cold War, the one that Sir Jeremy Isaacs produced, I told the producer, he ended it with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Russian flag rising over the Kremlin. A very dramatic scene, and I said, you know, it ended a couple of years before that. And he said, yeah, but that wasn't dramatic. So, okay, the drama and docudrama, I would say, misrepresented what the documents should have indicated. The second one is the talk of we won the Cold War. Well, yes, in a certain sense we did. I mean, it ended on terms that were quite satisfactory to us. But you know, we couch those terms, we and our allies, in terms that would be consistent with the national interests of a peaceful Soviet Union. These were Reagan's direct instructions when I was writing, our general strategy papers back in the mid-'80s. And every agreement that Gorbachev made was in the interest of the Soviet Union. We didn't take them to the cleaners. They had to change a lot of their policies. That's true. But those policies were already counterproductive from their standpoint, and he began to see that. So, in a sense, I would say that Gorbachev is right when, as he has written since, we all won the Cold War. And this was the logic that we pushed in our negotiations. If you ever go back and read Reagan's speech of January 16, 1984, you will find that he used the word cooperation over 30 times. And every single problem was couched in terms of cooperation. Even if it required, I would say 80 or 90% of the compromise on their side, not only the rhetoric, but the negotiating approach was we must cooperate. Now, I stress that because that combined with a policy of negotiating with everybody, no matter what happened, a Korean airliner shot down, an American officer killed in East Germany, when many in the Reagan administration wanted to break off negotiations, Reagan always said, we don't walk away from negotiating tables. And when they did, they lost every time. So we stayed in contact. And regardless, and particularly in the times when there were crises in the relationship, and instead of making public demands, we talked about cooperating to solve a common problem. Now, I think that's important when we get to the significance later of all the we won the Cold War rhetoric. Because that implied, usually when it was used, that Russia was a loser. And that's another of the myths. Russia, the Russian Federation of today, was not even the primary party to the Cold War. The Soviet Union was. And Russia was one of its components. And I can testify as one who spent the late 80s and right up to through most of 91 in Moscow negotiating with them, that the Russian leaders were even more cooperative than the Soviet leaders in helping us bring the Cold War to an end. So the idea that somehow Russia lost is an absurdity. Nobody lost. I think that thinking about that period, that three very important things happened. And they happened so quickly, and for most people so unexpectedly, that people conflate them in their minds. I call them geopolitically seismic, because they were the sort of changes that reshaped the map of the world. And the first of these was the end of the Cold War, a negotiated end that suited both sides. Let me say parenthetically that one of the most effective things Secretary of State Schultz did was do some lecturing to the Soviet leaders. Now, when he mentioned the idea of taking some charts and maps and giving them little lectures on economics, we said, oh my God, yeah, that's just not going to work. Of course, that was not what he had in mind. He was not going to teach them how capitalism works or, praise free enterprise. What his chart showed was how much the United States was spending as a proportion of its GNP on the military, how much the Soviet Union was spending in comparison with Germany, Japan, and other states that were growing much faster than either of us, and saying we're chumps. We have no reason, we have every reason not to fight each other. Why are we wasting all this money and depriving our people of the advances that others did? And later, both Gorbachev and Ryzhkov said these were among the most interesting things he had. And he would he'd bring his charts in and show them, this is what we're doing, this is what you're doing. Look what's happening to Japanese growth, and they put less than 1% of their GNP into defense. Persuasion, based upon the facts, and based upon the idea that we both can win. So the Cold War ended by cooperation, and particularly of the American and Western leaders, because we had good support from our allies, and Gorbachev, Reagan, and the first Bush were involved in essentially the same policies. Now, the second thing that happened that I call geopolitically seismic was the end of communist control of the Soviet Union. Now, I was particularly bemused, and more than bemused, perhaps annoyed, at the cover of The Economist magazine, one of my favorites, by the way, when Ronald Reagan died, and it had the slogan, "The Man Who Beat Communism." No, it wasn't Reagan who beat communism, it was Gorbachev, if you're speaking of communist rule in the Soviet Union. And, he could not have pushed his reforms if we had not ended the Cold War. And the end of the Cold War gave him the possibility of starting to reform the Soviet Union. So the idea that, another of the myths, that somehow we brought down communism by military force or economic force, is simply nonsense. If we had continued just to apply force rather than negotiation, and if we had had different policies, policies that really, I would say, really were against the national interests of a peaceful Soviet Union, then these reforms could not have been undertaken. The dictatorship would have been strengthened. So this misunderstanding has led us to policies which, since the Cold War, have actually strengthened dictatorships, in my opinion. Then the third event was the breakup of the Soviet Union. Did we force that, as some people seem to think, and is implied by many of the mythology? Again, absolute nonsense. We didn't want the Soviet Union to break up. We wanted the three Baltic countries to be allowed their independence, and we strongly supported that politically. But the other 12 republics, we really wanted to enter into a democratic federation, to form a democratic federation. And there were two reasons for that. One was we didn't want to see suddenly 12 nuclear powers where there had been one. And although, as it turned out, enough of the Soviet weapons were moved so that they were in only 4 of the states, at one time there would have been nuclear weapons in virtually all of them if they had broken up any sooner. And that was a big one. But also, those of us on the spot saw that the democratic changes that were going through the Soviet Union extraordinarily rapidly were being pushed by Gorbachev and that part of the Communist Party he controlled. It was maybe a minority, and this is particularly true in the non-Russian republics. Aside from the three Baltic states, they had developed independent course earlier. And actually, if there was a breakup, one might say prematurely, then you were going to leave communists in control of large areas of the country, and you were going to be blocking reform. So both in their interest and in ours, we hoped that there would be a negotiated Union treaty. And, you know, President Bush, the elder, made this clear in his infamous, as it became, speech in Kiev, August 1st, 1991, infamous in the words of Bill Safire, who called it his Chicken Kiev speech. But what did he say in that speech? And it was one directed not just at Ukraine, but we had briefed the press in advance at all the non-Russian, non-Baltic republics. And it was that freedom and independence are not synonymous. Choose freedom. And the second message was avoid suicidal nationalism. Was he talking about Ukraine? No, he was talking about Georgia. Because Gamsa-Kurdia, whom the Georgians had selected first, had already attacked Skinvali in South Ossetia and had actually blockaded the capital of South Ossetia in the middle of the winter at great cost to the local inhabitants. Now, we have recently seen that those problems have not gone away but have been further exacerbated. So the breakup of the Soviet Union happened not because of pressure from outside, but quite the opposite, because of pressures from the inside. And the way it happened was not something that was favored by American policy or by West European policy. You know, in the complicated negotiations over German unification, which went very rapidly in 1990, the main concern of many Western leaders, particularly Margaret Thatcher, but also Mitterrand and our George Bush, was to handle it in a way that would not weaken Gorbachev, because we saw that he was moving the country in the right direction and that he was facing pressures at home. Among the minor myths, I would say minor because I guess it doesn't matter all that much in the final analysis, is the idea that we didn't know what was happening and it all took us by surprise. Well, I sent my first message recommending that we make contingency plans for the breakup of the Soviet Union in July 1990, 18 months before it happened. It was drafted by Raymond Smith, who, by the way, has written a very interesting article for a scholarly journal on how it came about and why it is important to plan for contingencies which are of the unexpected and what things you look for. It's one of the things that international relations theory doesn't teach you. In fact, I don't think our theorists have yet come to terms with the way the Soviet Union broke up and the Cold War ended. It just doesn't fit any of them. So the fact was that, as I said, these three seismic events occurred so close together, and then most people didn't expect them, and then they get conflated in people's mind, and we've gotten the idea of triumphalism. I would then add one more myth or misunderstanding, and that was that the Cold War was anything like a real war. Now, the Cold War is obviously a metaphor for a confrontation. And the existence of nuclear weapons meant that, thank God, it never got hot. If it had gotten hot, we wouldn't be here today, most likely. But that meant that it was quite different. It was not a declared war. It was not anywhere there was any direct military action between the principal antagonists, you might say. It was not one where there was a settlement in the sense of a treaty. with one side by treaty accepting defeat. It had none of the characteristics that one would consider the main characteristics of a real war. And yet you get people writing about it as if it were World War III. I think the late Norman Podhoretz, just a couple of years ago, had a book, World War IV, holding that there was World War I, World War II, the Cold War was World War III, and the war on terrorism, another metaphorical war, by the way, is World War IV. Absolute nonsense. But these things got conflated in our minds, and connected with that, and we get back to Superpower Illusions, the idea that suddenly there had been two superpowers, so now there was just one. And since there was just one, that one had the power, if it chose to use it, to do anything it wished, including making other countries over in its own image. Now, my own observation is that the end of the Cold War, and particularly the breakup of the Soviet Union, reduced American power in the world. First of all, there were never two superpowers in the real sense, that these were powers that could transform other nations, certainly not by direct action. The Soviet Union didn't really control, other than, you might say superficially, its satellites in Eastern Europe. Yes, it could impose governments on them, but what was the result of that? I mean, the hostility, which will probably last for generations, of the people in those countries. Were the superpowers able to solve the problems in the Middle East? Well, you know, some problems maybe got exacerbated, particularly some of the fights, proxy fights in the Third World. But the ability to influence other countries, and particularly to transform them by military means, was, I would say, strictly limited. Of course, both countries had the means of destroying the world. You know, not just once, not just twice, by some calculations 7 times over. I never understood quite the rationale for that. Seems once you've done it once, you know, that should be enough. But what happens now? U.S. and Russia have enough nuclear weapons still out there deployed to not only destroy each other, but probably destroy everything else. But what really made us particularly powerful during the Cold War was the need of other countries for the protection against an expansionist communism. And once that disappeared, that element of soft power, there are other elements of soft power as well, but that element of soft power was lost. So the idea that suddenly we were the world's only superpower in the sense that we could act alone, I think was mistaken. And even those who said, well, you know, obviously this predominance is not going to last forever, but at least there is a unipolar moment. Remember that phrase? Well, there wasn't even a unipolar moment, because in the real sense, the world was not unipolar. And yet in the 90s, we, I think, missed a number of opportunities. Basically, the opportunity at the end of the Cold War was to be, in my view, was to systematically and by negotiation and carefully reduce our far-flung military presence in the world and build international regional structures for security. At the end of the Cold War, there was no need for us to maintain a predominantly military role in Europe, for example. It was very important for us to bring Russia in Western Europe and the former Soviet-dominated states in Eastern Europe into a security structure that could take care of the security problems on that continent without more than, I would say, minor, maybe logistic support from the United States. Instead, by expanding what had been one of the principal Cold War instruments to the east, and then attacking Serbia without a UN authority, we redivided Europe. in a way. The second thing we failed to do was to continue the rapid reduction of nuclear weapons. The vision that ultimately allowed Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev to bond was the vision both shared, and it was genuine, that we should move toward a world without nuclear weapons. These policies were followed basically by the first Bush administration, and we, of course, went through, signed two strategic arms agreements toward the end of the Bush administration, one in 91, another, I think, just before he left office in 92. So the momentum was very rapid in downloading, and we seemed to forget about it in the 90s. Finally getting a comprehensive test ban treaty, which, if anything, was in the American interest. I mean, that should have been a no-brainer. And if we're against proliferation, we know how to make nuclear weapons. We don't have to test to make as many as we want, and even new ones. Anybody who doesn't have them is going to have to test to make sure they work. So why don't you ban them? Well, Congress turned the treaty down in the late 90s. Now, the Clinton administration had recommended it, but of course the ratification came at a time when there were a lot of other problems in that administration, and I don't think people were paying that much attention. By the way, I think the Obama administration is sending that back to the Senate, and I certainly hope this time it's going to pass. But if we missed opportunities in the 90s, I think the second Bush administration destroyed many of them. And I recount those in the book. And in particularly, I have been struck not only by the way the Bush administration undermined and destroyed many of the international structures that had taken us so long to build up during the Cold War and which we still needed for peace in the world, particularly if the United States was not going to become the world's policeman, which I think we cannot afford to do. One of the reasons we're now the world's largest debtor nation is that we followed a policy opposite of contracting from military involvement in the world, which I think the end of the Cold War permitted us to do, to what seemed to be the opposite. And of course, all sorts of different reasons were given for that, and many in the intentions seem to be very good in a sense. But again, our intentions don't always guarantee the destination of the road that paves them. And that's been one of the, of course, the problems. I want to leave maximum time for questions, so let me just say that that one more thing, which I write about in the book. Obviously, I thought that the invasion of Iraq was a big error, no matter how you explain it, and I explain why. But also, and I think maybe for the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, the most traumatic thing, of course, was 9/11. And having read the 9/11 Commission report and much else, and comparing with my own experience on the NSC under several national security advisors, I say in the book, I call that chapter "Asleep at the Switch." Because any president I worked for, any national security advisor I worked for, if we had gotten a report that al-Qaeda was planning an attack on the United States, and adding that one of the prime means could be using hijacked planes, that national security advisor would have turned that government inside out for everything relevant to that in advance. And among other things, they would have found out the FAA has instructed pilots in the case of a hijacking to do what the hijacker asked. Now that came when people hijacked planes to fly to Cuba and you wanted to save everybody. It was pretty clear by 2001 if there was going to be a hijacking, it would be a suicide mission. The FAA wasn't even asked. And so those pilots had that. Now, changing that regulation in advance, under no circumstances give a hijacker control of the cockpit and reinforce it if necessary, alone would have prevented flying those planes into the buildings, even if they had been hijacked. And of course, there were other things that could have been done, such as making sure the CIA had let the FBI know of any al-Qaeda members who were in the United States. Of course, 2 of the hijackers were, and though it was known in the bowels of the CIA, that word hadn't gotten to the FBI. Or for that matter, having FBI headquarters query their district offices as to who had been learning to fly planes and where are they now. That information was out there, but nobody asked for it. Well, I don't want to go on this except to observe that what amazes me is the way the Democratic Party and the American people as a whole let the administration get by with what was in effect a cover-up. And in fact, turn it to their advantage by using this myth that the war on terrorism is a mortal threat to all of us and one which will take a worldwide military effort. So you have a few hundred guys, maybe even a few thousand, basically living in caves in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and this is a mortal threat to the United States requiring a world war. Just doesn't fit. Well, I had great hopes for the Obama administration while realizing that even with a different crew and a different attitude, it was going to be very hard to change a lot of American policies, and we are seeing this now. I would say that I finished my last touches on the book last May, so it was very early in the Obama administration. And I'm very encouraged by Obama's endorsement, which he did during the campaign and since has repeated in Prague, endorsing the initiative that George Shultz and others have done to revive the Reykjavik spirit and to continue steps to a world without nuclear weapons. But it's a slow process, and we still haven't seen a renewal of the Strategic Arms Treaty with Russia, though they keep promising that it's due to come almost any time. We can talk about that a bit if you wish to. So I think what we have seen is is basically a change in attitude, particularly on the matter of negotiation. But on some issues, particularly that of Iran is one of them, North Korea perhaps another, but particularly in Iran, I would have to say that, there are windows of opportunity for negotiation, and I think the correct stance should always be we are prepared to negotiate, and we are prepared to negotiate across the board. But I think the Obama administration has been handed probably the worst possible time to try to negotiate with Iran. And the problem is, of course, that aside from the windows of opportunity, is that, there is a lot of historical baggage on these various problems, and there is no one-size-fits-all policy. Each of the principal problems in the world, and even each of the more minor ones, is unique in certain respects. And I think another message I try to get across in the book is it's really dangerous to simply apply a theory without looking at the particulars, because God and the devil are in the details. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jack. And I will point out that you were wrong about one thing. You left plenty of time for discussion, so you didn't talk too long. We have lots of hands already going up, so why don't we... People with hands up, keep your hands up, and I'm going to start keeping a list.
Wait for the mic and speak very clearly. My hearing is going very fast, and I don't have my hearing aid today.
Okay, I think I have everybody. We'll start down here.
Thank you. Nikolai Zimin, Russian Weekly Magazine Itogi. Sir, you described how the myths you just defined, how those myths define the American policy and American, public opinion in some sense. But what do you think? How those myths influence the modern Russia policy toward the United States and toward the whole world? Thank you.
Yes. That's very important, and I do cover that to some degree in the book. When we start talking about having won the Cold War and acting as if Russia was defeated, and it doesn't matter what they think anymore, okay, they didn't want the expansion of the NATO military structure to the east, and we said, well, you know, you lost the Cold War, we'll do what we wish, and by the way, we're not threatening you. NATO is a defensive alliance. It is constitutionally incapable of attacking another country. And before you turn around, they're bombing Serbia, which had not attacked any NATO country. So I think that, first of all, the Russians felt, and I know people like Kozyrev and Yeltsin, very early on, they thought they had joined the West. And this was very important to them psychologically if they were going to be able to build any democratic institutions in Russia. So the idea that we defeated Russia, or defeated the Soviet Union for that matter, and then our actions seemed to fit another stereotype, is that we were trying to make them subordinate, even a colony. And then increasingly, as NATO continued to expand around their borders, they see themselves surrounded not just by countries which in many cases are hostile because of past policies, but are parts of an American-led military structure. I mean, I think you have to understand that that was not very helpful to those who wanted to build democratic institutions in Russia. So I think it did contribute to the Russian reaction. And even though that reaction, I think, was bad for Russia in many respects, I think we have to understand when many of the actions, well, even the last war in Georgia and the recognition of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, well, we attacked Serbia, we pulled off Kosovo, and then finally, when they objected, we recognized Kosovo's independence. Now, you know, I don't know why that was necessary. I mean, I understand why, on human rights grounds, we tried to stop the war, but on the other hand, Kosovo is not totally independent, and why you have to press and go ahead and recognize it. When the Russians have signaled they're going to do the same thing, you know, in the Caucasus, and of course they did. Now, I don't think they did themselves a favor, and I won't continue on this except to say you're absolutely right. The myths that were pushed here were shared there. And there's another side to that. When you start talking about a unipolar moment and the world's only superpower, everybody expects you to solve their problems. And if you don't, either you're hostile or at best indifferent. Because being the world's superpower, you should be able to take care of whatever problem they have. So it has left us, you know, by taking sides in regional disputes for whatever reason, we have actually, I think, made it harder, and we get blamed by both sides when they don't settle it.
We have a very long list, so what I'm going to do is take people in pairs and ask people to be focused. We're going to go right over here for the next two. We'll come back, and then we'll go towards the back.
Ambassador Matlock, thank you very much for your forceful presentation, and I suppose very good book, too. So my question, and I am George Krasnov. I represent Russia American Goodwill Associates. It's Association of Americans for Friendship with Russia. And my question concerns about two names, if they are familiar with you. I wonder, it's Wayne Murray, who was, I understand, political officer at the time, and he wrote in his memoir that it was a victory of economists over the politicians that was going on early in the 90s. And another person is Janine Wedel, who wrote, from my viewpoint, very interesting book called The Strange Case of Western Assistance to the East. And I understand she was a speaker here just a few weeks ago. So that's my question about those two people.
Okay, and before you answer, Jack, we'll take the other question right
here. I didn't catch those names.
Janine Wedel and Wayne Murray.
Yeah.
Wayne.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. My question goes back a little bit earlier to the intermediate nuclear force issue, which played out from the end of the Carter administration, as you know, in 79 to 87 when a treaty was signed. During that time, whether or not these Pershing IIs would be deployed seemed very much at issue in the United States and throughout the NATO period. I'm interested in your thoughts on how this contributed to the later issues surrounding the Soviet Union and Gorbachev, and in particular, if that George Shultz said when the first Pershing IIs were deployed in Germany, it was the D-Day of the Reagan administration. Did you ever think the deployment might fail? And did you ever think speculate on what the consequences might be if you did think that?
I didn't catch the first question.
The first question was specific reference to Wayne and Janine, but I think it started out with this notion that the economists won, not the politicians in the 90s.
Oh, the economists won.
Yeah. So I think that's a broader question.
Well, if the first question had to do with the economic basis of the breakup of the Soviet Union, certainly economic pressure played a role, but I think the late Gaidar, I don't understand how he could have died quite so young, but he said in his most recent book that although things like oil prices, the low oil prices certainly hurt, that this became an excuse rather than a reason for the breakup of the Soviet Union, if that was the basic.
And carrying it into the 1990s, that American policy was dominated by economists, not by...
Oh, that American policy was dominated. Well, certainly, if you're speaking of shock therapy and so on, it probably was. And I think that there were some real mistakes. For example, the Bush administration put no higher priority in economic issues than making sure that Russia would assume the debts of the Soviet Union, for example. So I think, and certainly much of the economic advice was what George Soros has called market fundamentalism, and I do write about that in the book. So much of it was not very useful given the circumstances. I think that's true. And in effect, they had the shock without the therapy. But in the final analysis, Russians, they're grown up. They made the decisions. So I don't really blame us primarily for this, but I am critical of those policies. And to some degree, I think that we could have handled things in a different way and more helpfully, particularly if we had come into the economic negotiations earlier. In fact, in my first series of negotiations in the Bush administration, February 89, I suggested that we start an intense dialogue on economic issues. And this was turned down for over a year because they thought that the Soviets wanted in the international economic organizations for a spoiler role. Later, we did, but it was almost too late by the time we really engaged them on economic issues. Now, on INF, I totally agree with George Shultz that the deployment and the ability finally to deploy was the turning point in convincing the Soviet leadership eventually that they had to reduce the arms. Were we worried? Yes, we were. Because, with the peace movement, particularly in Germany, it came almost to preventing it. And we now know from memoirs and other things that Andropov had decided that he was not going to negotiate, that they were going to put all out to turn it off by using the peace movement. Now, once we deployed, and Reagan throughout said, if we have to deploy, we'll take them away as soon as we have an agreement to do so. I think a lot of people didn't believe him, but that was the firm policy. And by February, '87, and I have quotes in my book on Reagan and Gorbachev from the Politburo records, which Svetlana Savinskaya at the National Security Archive provided me. Gorbachev was telling the Politburo, we have got to agree on INF, on the medium-range missiles, because this is a gun pointed at our head. We've got to go to zero. And when the defense minister said, well, now, what about the British and French systems? Because they had asked for compensation, and we had said no. He said, in effect, get real. There's not going to be a war with Britain and France. What the hell are you talking about? And he said, we got to get rid of these. And the reason was the military-industrial complex in the West is trying to force us in an arms race which we cannot win. And comrades, we have to prevent that. We have started, and he gave them a lecture, and he turned to the military and said, you have built so many arms that you're frightening the rest of the world, and you're robbing the Soviet people. And he made a significant statement. We can't even admit to our people how much we're spending until we get our spending down to the American level. Now, this is after the Reagan buildup. And he added, if they knew how much we were spending on the military, they wouldn't cut you in half. They'd cut you to a quarter of what you get. And this was directly to the defense minister. Now, this is interesting for me to read because one of Reagan's main objectives, and he put this in a memo before he first met Gorbachev in December '85, was, I must tell him that we don't want an arms race, but if he starts one or he continues the arms race, he's going to lose it, hands down. By '87, early '87, he had the message. And he had another message after Reykjavik, when they came so close on for radical reductions, and that was he had to take the rest of our agenda, which involved human rights, which involved withdrawing from military activities abroad, and opening up the Soviet Union to outside influence.
Okay, we're beginning to run out of time, so please keep your questions to the point. The gentleman in the middle and the gentleman on the aisle. Gentleman in the middle, who's looking at his BlackBerry, and he's about to forfeit his right to ask a question. Can I ask that communication devices be turned off? Even so.
Yeah, my question is that I was thinking about myths. Basically, the idea, well, two things really. It's about Ronald Reagan, rhetoric versus reality. He was taking somewhat of a, if you look at his foreign policy before he started talking with Russia, he actually continued much of our foreign policy during the Cold War with Nicaragua, El Salvador. We rigged those two elections. We didn't want free elections. And Grenada, Panama, and like all this time, and then the Afghan war. I mean, I can see that they wanted cooperation, but my first question was, I was wondering what Russia was thinking of this while he was trying to talk to them, but at the same time we were still pursuing our foreign policy of imperialism, basically, during the Cold War. And my second question is, this will be quick, why are we still pursuing an aggressive policy towards Russia? The media is constantly destroying Russia as bad guys, but like in reality, we're still pursuing aggressive policy towards them. Like with the START thing, we're expanding in countries that we said we wouldn't do it, like with NATO, and okay, we promised them, and that's like.
Okay, and this gentleman over here.
Ambassador Matlock, obviously apart from your own book, are there other accounts of the end of the Cold War that you have found particularly useful and valuable? And correspondingly, are you prepared to identify any that you found especially wrong-headed and misleading?
Okay, why don't we take these three questions?
Yeah, on the second one, I think on the breakup of the Soviet Union, the one by Dick Combs, I think is very perceptive, and he has a different take on a few things than the way I did. I think that there are two books on the Cold War as a whole, fairly short one by John Gaddis. And here again, there's not much I would disagree with in that. It's fairly short, doesn't get into some of the detail that I've mentioned. And there's a recent one which I've read only parts of, but looks pretty good. I think his name is Barras, or it was published University of California. Yes. And that's on the Cold War as a whole also. On books that I think are there was one, Victory, was it Peter Schweitzer? Something like that. Fellow at Hoover, he's written a couple of books. He's a journalist, sort of in the Victory thing. I think he gets it wrong. I think most of the descriptions you get by the neocons are wrong, and maybe in some cases calculatedly so. I take them on pretty hard in my current book. But now the earlier one question about wasn't there a contradiction between the attempt to resist communist incursions, particularly in Latin America, and calling for cooperation? No, there was no contradiction. As a matter of fact, Reagan explained in speeches at the UN in 1984 that his proposal was, he said, what has happened has been that the Soviet Union has injected military support in local disputes. And this has caused us also to back opposing forces. Why don't we both withdraw and help the parties make peace? And he added, and this was new for American policy, we do not blame the Soviet Union for these local disputes. The problem is their exploitation. And that has brought us into, you might say, the proxy, he didn't use the word proxy conflicts. And so part one of his proposals was, let's both withdraw. And eventually we were able to, on this basis. We negotiated, for example, in regard to Nicaragua. Eventually we got an agreement that there would be elections in Nicaragua, and if the Sandinistas won, we would have no more support to the Contras. If the Sandinistas lost, the Soviets would force the Cubans to leave and would give them no more support. The Sandinistas lost, but they survived, and recently they're back in power, having come in power by an election. We have no problem with that. At least I don't think so. I mean, Nicaraguans may eventually, but I think that the formula he used to get out of this situation, which did exist, was the formula that eventually got us out.
Okay, I think these will be the final two questions right down here.
Hi, I'm Marilys Lugo, the Favorites, Howard University. At a previous conference this year here at the Canon, there was a scholar who mentioned the emergence of a new term, Putinism, to describe what's been happening kind of in the post-Yeltsin governmental regime. So take out your little tea leaves. What do you see Putin's newest advances in government technology, so to speak, and what do you see happening kind of in the next 10 years?
And actually, my question will go very well with that. Gardner Bovington, Indiana University. I found very refreshing your emphasis on a foreign policy which attempts to find areas of common interest between the two sides, in contrast to the cowboy policies of the last few years that emphasized forcing the will of the United States on other parties without regard to an often indirect contradiction to their perceived interests. I'm interested in the problem of what you do when, and I'm asking for you to give policy advice, what do you do when the so-called national interest and regime interests seem to be in conflict? And here I'm thinking, to pick a big example, the Chinese Communist Party. I'm also thinking of Putin, for instance, Ahmadinejad and the clerics in Iran. And then I'm thinking, to pick a very small example, Netanyahu's regime in Israel right now. It seems to me in each case, regime interest and national interest are distinctly at odds, and that poses a real foreign policy challenge.
The second question, I think, is, since it's freshest on my mind, I'll address first. Of course, there's no simple answer. And what you have described is a dilemma. 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 And what you it does mean that probably the best approach is not to say that our goal is democracy, because anytime you're dealing with an undemocratic government, you make yourself an enemy of the regime. And it's not that you don't want other countries to get them, but you have to recognize that they've got to find a way there somehow, and the best way you can help is to do no harm. And by engaging too overtly, I think you don't get anywhere. You know, I don't think that the boycotts and so on have weakened Castro. I think rather they have probably kept the regime intact. I don't know why we didn't at least open up trade and so on. You don't have to come to full agreement on everything. Instead, we have to say you have to change first. And that usually doesn't work, particularly if what you are going after is considered as undermining the power of the regime. This is our problem with China and human rights, by the way, because the Chinese read Gorbachev's policies as what not to do. Don't open up politically first. And the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, to them, is proof. My book, Autopsy on an Empire, the first translation made of that was in Chinese. And it was actually an item of discussion at the next party Congress. And so, you know, if you come out overtly, you're against that regime, I mean, it's very hard to do anything. And so, in a sense, you have to keep, if you keep communications open, as we did with the Soviet leaders, and increase them, not just at the top, but do your best to penetrate as much of the bureaucracy as you can, penetrate in the sense of a dialogue and contacts and so on, and you define your policies so they don't seem threatening to that regime as such, and find things that would be which they would like to have, then you can do it. But there's no easy way. And right now, given all of the history and given the fact that we passed up, I believe, opportunities in the past, particularly in 2003, to negotiate with Iran, and now you've got a government that is under so much pressure at home, their interests are in being attacked by us. So the more pressure you bear on them, the more you fulfill what Ahmadinejad wants, and that is to shift the blame to outsiders. Much the same, I think, is true, as you mentioned, Israel. And when you have an Israeli policy that, in my view, is following policies very much inimical to the long-term interests of Israel, how do you get them to see that? It's not easy. It does take a certain patience, but I don't profess to have an automatic key other than patience, and recognize that when you talk about hostility, when you have actions that seem hostile to the whole nation, it doesn't help you. In the case of Iran now, you know, the previous administration put them in an axis of evil and attacked what was the other two to think? And particularly since the only way you can be sure the United States doesn't attack is to get nuclear weapons. I mean, do we not understand the signals our actions give? But having gotten that, what do we do now? I think the worst thing from our standpoint that could happen would be an attack on the nuclear facility, because I think it wouldn't erase their capability, and it would do Ahmadinejad a great favor. My own guess is he is trying to invite that attack, and yet we're told, oh, you can't take that off the table. Come on. You're probably not going to be able to deal with that regime unless you take that off the table and begin to find some things, like in Afghanistan and other places, that Iranian interests are not inimical to ours. And if we at least talk about those things first and calm all this hysteria over their nuclear weapons, which I think would be no more a threat than the Pakistani weapon, if you think about that. But our tactics have been the very ones that would convince the Iranians they need them. And not only Ahmadinejad, probably the opposition as well. Now, the first question, I'm afraid I got...
On Putin.
Oh, Putin. Yeah, well, what can I say? As I said, I think that some of the policies he used as an excuse for policies, their interpretation of what I thought were mistakes made earlier. I believe that the concentration of power internally is certainly not in Russia's interest. I think it was not in Russia's interest to conduct the war in Georgia the way they did. They are now confronted with a very, very unstable southern border in the Caucasus, and not just in Chechnya, but in Dagestan and really across the board. The Abkhazians, I'm sure, don't want to be under Russian domination, but they want even less to be under Georgian domination, and the Georgians don't give them much of an out. So, I think those problems are going to simmer along. But I do think that Putin's external policy has been very popular in Russia because of many of the misunderstandings that we've already described. And though he may not be as popular as some of the polls suggest, I'm told by friends in Moscow and Petersburg that he's very unpopular there. And of course, many people hope that Medvedev will be able to split off those. What is happening in Russian politics today, I have no idea. I've used the old cliche, it's like a dogfight under the rug, and thank goodness I'm not under there to watch.
Jack, I'm fascinated by listening to your talk and thinking about sort of your own trajectory. You were an important figure in the Reagan administration, which at the time was viewed as being full of Cold Warriors, and yet your critique of American policy sounds perhaps more in line with voices that were at the time thought to be a little softer on the Soviet Union. Has Jack Matlock changed, or has the context changed? Would you have given this talk 20 years ago?
Well, I wouldn't have given part of it because a lot of the things I'm commenting on hadn't happened.
Fair enough.
One of my sayings, I was often asked, particularly in those last years of the Soviet Union, what do you think is going to happen? And I would say, I don't know. Now, when it happens, I'll tell you why it was inevitable. But my view of some things has changed. I was a strong supporter of the war in Vietnam, although I thought we should have gotten out earlier. I was beginning to question the validity of staying on those last 2 years, and I didn't like the way the Nixon administration handled the domestic opposition. And in a few other judgments, I think that was, I can't say I've not changed any of my views, but my basic point is that the Soviet Union was changing, and was changing very rapidly. And it was changing under our influence, although they were making the decisions. And by 1991, you had a country that was freer then than it is today. And so the idea that the breakup of the Soviet Union was an unalloyed victory for the West, I thought was wrong. And I said in my Autopsy on an Empire, which was published in 1995, I was unable to celebrate the collapse of the Soviet Union. I left the champagne corked because I could foresee that happening when and as it did, it was going to bring great problems, particularly to the people in that area. Not so much for us, but for the people there. So in that sense, I don't think I had hoped for a different policy on the part of the United States, and as we didn't get it, yes, looking back. I'll just add, since I occupied the Kennan chair, and this is the Kennan Institute, that fundamentally I think George Kennan had it right. Now, when I was in government service, I disagreed with him on a very basic point, and that was the amount of military pressure it required to make containment possible. We did disagree on that. Part of George's criticism, though, he exaggerated the amount of it and at times didn't believe that we genuinely had some of the policies that we were following. I would communicate with him when I was director of Soviet Affairs, and then later privately. And as I explained what we were trying to do, he really did, I would say, endorse most of them. So ultimately, my judgments were not that different from his, though there were many times. I did think NATO was necessary. I didn't think that a neutral Germany would be a good thing at that time, and so on. In fact, I think a neutral Germany, even today, is not a good thing for the future. You want a Germany embedded in Europe and embedded in an organization like NATO. So on those issues, I differed with Kennan. But the basic idea is that, one thing, the Soviet Union was unstable because of internal contradictions and would eventually bring itself down. I certainly agreed with that the whole time. And the distinction between Russia and the Soviet Union was one that I made maybe even more sharply than Kennan. I tried not to refer to the Soviet Union as Soviet Russia. For me, Soviet Russia was the RSFSR. It's cumbersome sometimes. But instead of talking about the Russians, I would talk about the Soviets, knowing that in Russian that makes no sense. It's the councils. But to get the idea that not all Soviet citizens are Russians, and also that it was a communist empire and not a Russian empire. I think these things were understood by Kennan, and these are things that I also understood. And I think that both of us probably were able to understand better what was happening when it was changing than many others who had concentrated on foreign affairs.
Jack, thank you very much. Again, Superpower Illusions, it's available outside.
Yeah.